How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 80 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, the power washers are outside. They have been outside now for about 45 minutes. Their power washer is broken. But the power washers, there's a big Musar Haskell we can learn from the power washers. They are committed to their craft. They power wash in the middle of a rainstorm. They power wash when their power washer is broken. It feels almost like when you're trying to take blood, but you can't find the vein, so you just keep on poking, and you just want to get over with already. So they're just the machine's broken, but they just keep on trying to use it, and it's making so much noise, but they're not getting anywhere because it's broken. But they don't give up. Like I would just be like, okay, maybe we don't need it today. After all, we did it yesterday and the day before that and the day before that. I mean, we don't need to do this every single day. But anyways, they are committed and they are inspiring us all. Friends, today Daf Pei is a doozy. It's a mushy daf. Our brains will be mush. The first topic of today, so there's the Daf Pei talks about a lot of stuff. Daf Pei talks about a lot of stuff, but I think it can be boiled down into two things. One is offering the child of a Todah. Sounds tricky. It is. Offering the child of the Todah, that is really going to be Pei Amud Aleph. And that's where the complexity of today's daf is going to be. It's going to be, we're going to have to use our noggins big time. I expect that most of our brains, first and foremost, starting with mine, will be mush by the end of the daf. The next topic is when the korbin keeps on getting lost. Also sounds complicated. The thing is, it isn't actually as complicated because it actually moves quicker. The first part is the real mushy part. Now we're going to end on Daf Pei Amud Beis, honestly about halfway or so through the Amud, because that's where we start another complex sugya, a Temura sugya. I've been warning about Temura recently because it's been coming up. That sugya takes us till the end of Pei Aleph Mid Aleph. So I figured, A, I didn't want to stop in the middle of the sugya, and B, I anticipate that most of our brains are going to be mush by then anyways. I don't want to start a new complicated topic, even though it is Erev Pesach, and I'm going to be way pressed for time, and I'm going to have to, and this is, I expect this is going to be a long daf. I expect that the next daf is going to be long as well, but that's just part of the fun around here. Friends, let's jump into Daf Pei of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we begin on Daf Ayin Tes Amid Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Shalach Rav Chanina Mishmei Reb Yechanan. Rav Chanina sent in the name of Reb Yechanan Lo Shanu. They didn't teach. El Acher Kapara, only after Kapara. Avalifnei Kapara Tu'unin Lechem. But before Kapara, there's a requirement for bread. That when we say that a korbin Todah does not require bread, that is after kapara. But before kapara, it does require bread. Now, let's go back for a second. So Rav Amram wants to know, what are we talking about? So before we get into what we're actually talking about, just for context of like Bigadol, what are we talking about? Well, let's just say, for example, we learned yesterday at the end of the daf that if you set aside Sarah the U to be your korbin Todah, and then Sarah the U flies the coop. This is going to be today's daf, like all about it's like Yavamis in some ways, right? Like setting up scenarios. It's going to be a lot of that, a lot of Sarah and Rivka the U and Sarah Junior the U. There's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff. So, anyways, so you have Sarah the U is going to be your Todah. Sarah the U gets lost. So Rivka the U is set aside to be the Todah instead of Sarah the U, because Sarah the U is gone. Sarah the U saunters back to the flock. So now you have Sarah the U and Rivka the U. So what this could be saying, Kilu, in principle, what this is saying is that, well, if when Sarah the U saunters back, Rivka the U had not yet been offered, which means that you could choose either to offer Sarah the U or Rivka the U as your korbin Todah now, because you have 2 options. And since the korbin Todah has not yet been offered yet, So therefore, whichever is going to be offered will be offered with the breads, with the 40 loaves. However, if by the time Sarah the U sauntered back, Rivka the U had already been offered, or alternatively, Sarah the U saunters back, Rivka the U is still there, one of them is offered, now you're offering the second one, but basically the point is, at the time that you're offering this one, the official korbin Todah has already been offered, so then the next one, the second one, will be offered without all of the 40 breads. So let's start again. Shalach Rav Chanina Mishmei Reb Yechanan, Rav Chanina sent in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, Lo Shanu, when we talk about a korbin Todah being offered, kind of like a replacement Todah being offered without any of the 40 loaves, El La'achar Kapara, that's only when the actual korbin Todah has already been offered. Avalifne kapar, but if no korbin Todah has yet been offered, and this is the korbin Todah, well then tunin lechem, well then you're going to offer it with the 40 loaves. Now Rav Amin wants to know what context is this statement in, because I just explained it based on, like we learned at the end of the daf yesterday, based on Mishnayos and Brises. If that's the case, I don't need Rabbi Yochanan to teach me that, right? So what's the chiddush here? What's Rabbi Yochanan teaching us? Ilema achilufei Todas chova. If it's like I was just explaining, that it's the chilufei Todas chova, what's a Todas chova? This is important. So we're going to be discussing now two types of Todas. A neder and a nedava. The chova is a reference to a neder. There's also a nedava. What's the difference between a neder and a nedava? Who could tell us what's the difference between a neder and a nedava? The first Mishnah, Masechta Kinim, very famous Mishnah in a very niche Masechta. We will get to Masechta Kinim. It's a very difficult Masechta. We learned, of course, Masechta Kinim, and what we learned. We had a deep dive into Kinim in Masechta Zvachim, if you remember. The first Mishnah, Masechta Kinim, is not difficult, and in that Mishnah, there's a very famous statement that says that what is the difference between a neder and a nedava? A neder is when a person says, in our context, I am going to bring a korbin Todah. So when a person says, I am going to bring a korbin Todah, he has an obligation to bring a korbin Todah. That obligation is not linked, is not connected to any specific animal. Even if he were to set aside Sarah the U to be his korbin Todah and Sarah the U flies the coop, he still has his obligation that he declared that he's going to bring a korbin Todah. So fine, he's got to bring Rivka the U then. A nidava is when a person says, in our context of a Todah, Sarah the U, I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. In that case, he's directly linking his obligation to Sarah, that he's going to bring Sarah the U as a korbin Todah. If Sarah the U flies the coop, so does his obligation. He has no obligation to bring Rivka the U as a korbin Todah. He said, I'm going to bring Sarah the U as a korbin Todah. That's it. Sarah the U dies, stolen, lost, whatever. He has no, okay, his obligation is gone. It was directly linked to Sarah the U. Now, if we're going to say that the scenario that Rabbi Yochanan is talking about is when a person says, I am going to bring a korbin Todah, and he sets aside, Sarah the U to be his korbin Todah. Sarah the U flies the coop, so he sets aside Rivka the U, right? Because he still has the obligation, so he sets aside Rivka the U to be his korbin Todah. And then Sarah the U saunters back, and we're saying that, like we said earlier, if no Todah has yet been offered, so the first one to be offered is going to be with the 40 loaves. If the korbin Todah has already been offered, let's say Rivka the U was already offered, so then the next Todah will be without the breads. But if that's the case, ilifne kapara, if we're saying that if the Todah has not yet been offered, so it'll be with the breads, tanina. We already learned that yesterday in the Mishnah and the Brisa, that the first one to be offered will be with the breads. Ila acher kapara tanina. And also, if we're talking about once one of them has been offered, that the second one will be without breads, will be breadless, like we're going to be for the next week, although we will have matzahs, and obviously 3/4 of the loaves are matzah loaves. Anyways, if Rabbi Yochanan is teaching us that once one of them has been offered as a Todah, then the next one will be without the breads. Also, we learned that already yesterday. So Rabbi Yochanan can't be teaching us that. It must be something more interesting, because that we already know from our Mishnah, from the Brisa at the end of the Daf yesterday. Elo achalife todas nedava. Excuse me, I'm going to take a little bit to drink here. Rather, it's the same scenario, but instead of a neder, we're talking about a nedava. A scenario where, so let's call him Ruvain, right? Just so we have a name for the owner of the korbin. So Ruvain says, Sarah the U, I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. He's directly linking his obligation and his intention to bring a korbin Todah to Sarah the U. Now Sarah the U flies the coop. So what does he do? He says, okay, fine, Rivka the U, I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. Now, if that's the case, he had no obligation to offer Rivka the U as a korbin Todah, because his obligation was directly linked and limited to Sarah the U. When Sarah the U flew the coop, he no longer has an obligation to be a korbin Todah. He only had an obligation to offer Sarah. Sarah's gone. When he then says, okay, I'm going to offer Rivka, that's a completely new korbin Todah. And if that's the case, regardless of if was Sarah offered, not offered, when Sarah was found, was Rivka, makes no difference. These are two independent korbin Todahs, since he had no obligation to follow up. When he chose to follow up with Rivka, that's a completely new korbin Todah. Then of course he's going to, no matter what, he's going to offer it with the 40 loaves. Ella achlufe, right, top line of Pei Amud Aleph. Ella achalife todas nedava. If we're talking about a nedava, when he says, I am going to bring Sarah the U as a korbin Todah, Sarah the U flies the coop, and now he designates, he says, okay, I'm going to offer Rivka the U as a korbin Todah. Well, if that's the case, bein lifnei kapara, whether Sarah or Rivka, it doesn't matter, whether one of them was already offered, bein la'achar kapara, whether neither of them was yet offered, or whether one of them was already offered, it makes no difference. Tunos lechem, both of them are going to require all of the loaves, because Marbi b'Todah su, he's volunteering to offer multiple korbin Todahs. It's not like one of them is for the obligation and the other one is an extra one. No, they're two separate obligations. Elo, rather, avlad todas nidava. Okay, what happens in this case? So this is also a nidava. Ruvain says, Sarah the U, I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. The korbin Todah is limited to Sarah the U. If Sarah the U gets lost, the obligation is gone. Now, Sarah the U is pregnant. Sarah the U is pregnant. So Reuven says, hey, Sarah the U, I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. Sarah the U is pregnant. Sarah the U gives birth to Sarah Jr. the U. Sarah the U, upon whom the obligation for the korbin is, flies the coop. Sarah the U flies the coop. So essentially that means that his obligation flew the coop. If he then goes and he offers Sarah Jr. the U, either way there will be no Todahs, because we'll view Sarah Jr. the U as just like a growth of Sarah the U, meaning he had said specifically to Sarah the U, I'm going to offer you as a korbin Todah. Sarah the U was growing a baby. Sarah Jr. the U, which ended up being Sarah Jr. the U. But his obligation was limited to Sarah the U, not this growth that was growing on Sarah the U that emerged into Sarah Jr. the U. The obligation is limited to the mother, is limited to Sarah the U. He has no obligation for Sarah Jr. the U. And therefore, regardless of if Sarah the U was offered or not, it makes no difference. Sarah Jr. the U, there was no obligation. He never committed to offering Sarah Jr. the U as a korbin Todah. And therefore, Sarah Jr. the U, either way, will be offered without these breads. And regardless of if Sarah Jr. the U was offered or not, when Sarah the U saunters back to the flock, Sarah the U will be offered as his korbin Todah that he committed to offering her, and with the 40 breads. So, again, so says the Gemara inside, Ella Avlad Todas Nedava. So if we're talking about that he says to Sarah the U, I am going to offer you as a korbin Todah, and his obligation is limited strictly to Sarah the U, not even to her growing fetus that emerges as Sarah Jr. the U, not to Sarah Jr. the U, specifically limited to Sarah the U. So bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara. So if you're going to offer Sarah Jr. the U, regardless of if it's before Sarah the U has been offered or after, regardless, Sarah Jr. the U will be offered without any breads. Ein tu'unin lechem, there won't be any of the breads, moser de todahu, because Sarah Jr. the U is just considered an extra, a growth onto her mother who the obligation was on. But this growth that grew into Sarah Jr. the U, there was not an obligation to bring a korbin Todah, and regardless of when it's offered, before Sarah the U, after Sarah the U, makes no difference. Sarah Jr. the U will be without the 40 breads. So again, where is this chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan that before the kapara there will be the breads, after the kapara there won't be the breads, that we don't yet know? So Elo Avlad Todas Chova. Okay, rather it's talking about a scenario where Reuven says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah. This obligation is greater than any specific animal. If he says, okay, Sarah the U, you're going to be my korbin Todah, and Sarah the U flies the coop, he still has the obligation. So he designates Rivka the U, you'll be my korbin Todah. Now, the case that we're talking about is that he designates Sarah the U for his korbin Todah that he committed to bringing. So he has to bring korbin Todah. He says, okay, Sarah the U, it's going to be you. Sarah the U is pregnant. Sarah the U gives birth to Sarah Jr. the U. And Sarah the U flies the coop. Now he still has this obligation to bring a korbin Todah. He had designated Sarah the U. Sarah the U flew the coop. And what he does is, he still has this obligation. He had set aside Sarah the U. Sarah the U was pregnant. Sarah the U gave birth to Sarah Jr. the U. Sarah flew the coop. So you know what? He could offer Sarah Jr. the U. And if he's offering Sarah Jr. the U, and he hasn't yet offered Sarah the U, so he'll offer Sarah Jr. the U with the 40 loaves. However, if Sarah the U saunters back, and he offers Sarah the U, well then Sarah Jr. the U would be offered without the 40 loaves. And what's the chiddush here? The chiddush here is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, you can satisfy your obligation that when a person says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah, and he has an obligation to bring a korbin Todah, that obligation can be satisfied with Sarah Jr. the U, which at the time that Sarah the U was set aside as the Korban Todah. Sarah Junior, there was just a growth on Sarah the U. Sarah the U was designated as a Korban Todah. At the time, Sarah Junior there was a growing fetus. When Sarah Junior the U is then born, the Chiddush is that it can be used to satisfy. Sarah Junior the U can be offered, and as this kind of Mosar, as this kind of growth, right? Mosar hektish, right? Gidule hektish, that which grew onto the hektish, right? He had set aside Sarah the U, and then what emerged from Sarah the U after it was designated as a Korbin was Sarah Junior the U. Sarah Junior the U, this emergence can also be offered as the obligation, and therefore if Sarah Junior the U is offered first, it would be offered with the 40 loaves. If Sarah the U was offered first and then you offer Sarah Junior the U, it would be offered without the 40 loaves, and that is the Chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan, that you can satisfy your obligation with these Gidulei Hektish, with something that grows onto the Hektish even after it was a point to set aside as Hektish. That even after Sarah the U was set aside, was designated as the Korbin, it then developed and grew. Sarah Junior the U, that was this subsequent growth, can also be offered and fulfill the obligation. So Elo Avlad Todas Chova, rather, the Chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan is for when a person says, I'm going to bring a Korban Todah, and then he says to Sarah the U, I'm going to offer you, and Sarah the U is pregnant, and then he ends up offering, Sarah Junior the U is born, and he offers Sarah Junior the U. If it's Lifnei Kapara, if that is the Korban Todah, if Sarah the U had not been offered as the Korban Todah, Ta'un Lechem, so then you would offer Sarah Junior the U with bread. Le'achar Kapara, however, if you offer Sarah the U, so then Sarah Junior the U would be offered Ein Ta'un Lechem, without bread. By the way, I was saying that Sarah the U flew the coop. I don't think it matters if Sarah the U flies the coop. I don't think it actually matters if Sarah the U flies the coop, even if Sarah the U is there. I think the point is just with whichever one is offered first, we'll get the breads. My Kamashmon, what's it teaching us? The Kasav Rabbi Yochanan holds Adam Miskaper, that a person can be atoned, can fulfill his obligation, bishvach hektish, with benefits to hektish, that he had set aside Sarah the U, and it had Sarah the U then developed Sarah Junior the U. You can fulfill your obligation with Sarah Junior the U. Haviba Nami Abaye. Abaye was also wondering the same thing that Rav Amram was wondering. Rav Amram was wondering what is the scenario that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about, and he arrived that he concluded that it's talking about the Vlad Chova, right? When he says, "I'm going to bring a Korban Todah," and he sets aside Sarah, who's pregnant, right? That case. So Abai was wondering the same thing as Rav Amram, and he settled it in the same way, right? Haviba Abai ki agavno. Abai was wondering the same thing that Rav Amram was wondering, and he also arrived at the same conclusion. It Manami, it's also stated, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, says Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Chilufei Todas Nidava. When it comes to a Todas Nidava, when the obligation for the Todah is limited specifically to Sarah the U, Sarah the U flies the coop. Now there's no need to designate a replacement because the obligation was limited to Sarah the U, but he nonetheless says, I'm going to offer Rivka the U. So Bein Lifnei Kapar, Bein Lachar Kapar, Tunin Lechem. Since there was no obligation, so Sarah the U and Rivka the U are both just Korban Todas that he's offered, right. They're separate Korban Todas, since there was no obligation for Rivka, and he separately said, I'm going to offer Rivka the U. And therefore, both Sarah the U, when Sarah the U saunters back to the flock, as well as Rivka the U, both are going to require 40 loaves. Tunin Lechem, because Marbe B'Todasu, he's just bringing multiple Korban Todas, since there was no obligation to bring Rivka the U, and he chose to offer her anyways. Vlad Todas Nidava. Also, when it comes to a Nidava, when he says specifically that he's going to offer Sarah the U as a Todah, and Sarah the U then gives birth to Sarah Junior the U. Bein lifnei kapar bein lacha kapar ein toun lechem. Moser the Todah. Whether Sarah Junior the U is offered before Sarah the U was offered, after the Sarah the U was offered, it makes no difference, since it is the child of a nidava. It's considered extra. It's not considered part of any obligation, and therefore will be without the breads, without 40 loaves. Vlad Todah's chova, Sarah Junior the U, in a case where Reuven had committed to bringing a korbin Todah, well, in that case, and you can also add v'chalife Todah's chova, also when he says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah, and he designates Sarah the U flies the coop, so then he designates Rivka the U. In both of those cases, a lifnei kapara tu'unin lechem, if whichever is offered first will require the 40 loaves, la'acha kapara, whichever is offered second, ain't tu'unin lechem, do not require the 40 loaves. Wow, givaldik, sheesh. Okay, so we had that position of Rabbi Yochanan about whichever one is offered first requires the 40 loaves, whichever is offered second doesn't require the 40 loaves. We're trying to figure out which case that is. It is the case of when a person obligates himself to bring a korbin Todah, and he sets aside Sarah the U. Sarah the U is pregnant, gives birth to Rivka the U. No, gives birth to Sarah Junior the U. If Sarah Junior the U is offered first, it will be with the 40 loaves. If it's offered second, it will be without the 40 loaves. And now we get to the opinion of Shmuel. Shmuel lays out an interesting principle here, a very interesting and complex principle over here. And ultimately, he's going to arrive at a different conclusion to Rabbi Yochanan. And he's going to say that when it comes to this child, to Sarah Junior the U, it would be without any of the 40 loaves. Okay, givaldik. Omar Shmuel says, Kol shebechatos mesa betoda ein tuna lechem. Kol shebechatos roe betoda tuna lechem. Sheesh. This is always a complicated principle. Whenever you get into kol shebechatos whatever, kol shebechatos mesa, you know it's going to be complicated. There are, of course, 5 scenarios where a chatas is left to die. What are the 5 scenarios? Who could tell me? Usually I can only remember 3. I should be able at this point to remember all 5. 3 of them were in yesterday's Mishnah. Vlad chatas, if a chatas gives birth to a baby, that baby is left to die. Tmuras chatas, right? If Sarah the U is set aside as a korbin chatas, and he says, you know what? Instead, I want to offer Rivka the U is left to die. Also, if Sarah the U is set aside as the korbin chatas, Sarah the U flies the coop, Rivka the U is then set aside and offered as the korbin chatas, Sarah the U then saunters back to the flock. That is a scenario of chatas shekipru ba'aleh be'acher, that the owners already got their kapara, Sarah the U is going to be left to die. The next case is chatas shemesu ba'aleh, that if you have a korbin chatas that the owners died, the korbin chatas is let to die as well, because you're not going to offer the korbin chatas if the owner is dead. And finally, chatas she'ava shnosa. Chatas has to be within its first year of its life. If it lives to be into its second year, it can no longer be offered as a chatas, and we leave it to die. Now, there are, of course, principles that kol shebechatas mesa be'asham yireh. Any of these scenarios, if we're talking about a korbin ashram, you're just going to let it graze and get a mum, etc. If we're talking about a korbin chatas, any scenario, says Shmuel, his principle is that any scenario in which, any of the 5 scenarios where by a korbin chatas, the halacha would be that you leave it to die, by a korbin Todah, it would be offered without the 40 loaves. Now, any scenario by a korbin chatas where the halacha would be that you let it graze until it gets a mum, and then you sell it, and the money goes to the donations to buy olos kates on mizbeach, that whenever there's no korbanos offered on the mizbeach, so they would just always have korban olas to make sure there's at least always something burning. So any scenario where the halacha is that you would let the chatas graze until it gets a mum, then it would be sold and the proceeds would go towards these nidavas. Well, by a korbin, that same case, by a korbin todah, the animal would be offered as a korbin todah with the 40 loaves. So that's Shmuel's principle, that any scenario whereby a korbin chatas, it's left to die, by a korbin todah, it's offered without the loaves. Any scenario by a korbin chatas where it's left to graze, by a korbin todah, it would be offered with the 40 loaves. That is Shmuel's principle. Again, Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel, kol shebechatas mesa, any scenario where by a korbin chatas, it would be left to die. But todah ein tuna lechem, if we're talking about a korbin todah, that same scenario, the animal would be offered, but without the breads. Kol shebechatas roeh, and whenever the halacha is by a korbin chatas, that it is left to graze and get a mum, etc. Betoda tuna lechem, by a korbin todah, it would be offered as a korbin todah and with the 40 loaves. Masiv Rav Amram, however, Rav Amram tries to cast a chink in Shmuel's principle from the brisa that we learned at the end of the daf yesterday. Masiv Rav Amram as a kasha. We learned in the brisa yesterday, Ma'u Omer HaTodah Yakriv. What does it mean? The pasuk says, what does the pasuk say? Im al Todah yakrivenu vehikriv. Just say Im al Todah vehikriv. What's yakrivenu? What's the yakriv? Minayin limafresh todaso ve'ovda. How do you know? We learned this yesterday. Then how do you know that in a scenario where a korbin, where Sarah the U is set aside as a korbin todah, ve'ovda Sarah the U flew the coop. So therefore, instead, Rivka the U was designated as the korbin as the korbin todah, since Sarah the U flew the coop. V'nim says Harishona. Sarah the U then sauntered back to the flock. Vareshte omdos, and now you have Sarah the U and Rivka the U, both of which have been set aside to be a korbin todah. So what do you do? So how do we know? Choose one of them and offer it as a korbin todah. How do we know you just choose one to offer as a korbin todah? Tamalomar HaTodah Yakriv. That you will offer a korbin todah, you'll offer one of them as a korbin todah. Yachol tehei shnia tuna lechem. Is it possible that the second one will be offered also with the 40 breads? It will be offered with all of the breads. Echad v'lo. One of them will be offered with all of the breads. The other will be offered, but without the breads. So what did we just see over here? We just said that in a scenario, where Sarah the U was set aside as a korbin todah, Sarah the U flew the coop. Rivka the U was then set aside to be the korbin todah since Sarah the U was gone. Now, Sarah the U sauntered back to the flock, and now you have Sarah the U and Rivka the U. Sarah the U was then offered as the korbin todah with all the breads. And what do we say happens to Rivka the U now? It's offered without any of the breads. The thing is, if this was the case by a korbin chatas, if Sarah the U was set aside as a korbin chatas and then it flew the coop, so Rivka the U was set as a korbin chatas instead. Sarah the U then sauntered back to the flock. Now you have Sarah the U and Rivka the U. When it comes to korbin chatas, if Sarah the U is now offered as a korbin chatas, you know what happens to Rivka the U in this case? You might be thinking, oh, I know. Chatas sheniskapu b'alim ba'acher. Well, there was already a kapara, so Sarah the U is going to be starved to death, right? Rivka the Sarah that was offered as a chatas, Rivka that was going to be starved to death. No. When we say that when there was already kapara, that's talking about if when Sarah sauntered back to the flock, Rivka had already been offered, right? Rivka was then set aside to be designated as the korbin chata since Sarah the U flew the coop. Rivka was set aside as the chatas and actually offered as the chatas, and then Sarah saunters back. So we say, well, the owner already got kapara. Sarah is going to be left to die. But if at the time that Sarah saunters back to the flock, Rivka had not yet been offered, now you have both of them. In that case, at least according to the Chachamim, we can see it's machlokes. At least according to the Chachamim, in that case, if you offer Sarah the U as your korbin chatas, what happens to Rivka the U? You don't let Rivka the U die. You let Rivka the U graze until Rivka the U gets a mum. And when Rivka the U gets a mum, it's sold and the money goes to Olas Nedava. So based on Shmuel's principle, what would follow? Well, since Rivka the U is let to graze, if this was the same case by a korbin Todah where Sarah also entered back to the flock, have Sarah and Rivka, Sarah was then offered as a korbin Todah. Based on the principle of whatever would happen to Rivka by a chatas, which in this case we're saying is it would be left to graze, by a Todah it would be offered with the 40 loaves, I would think that Rivka the U, in the case of the Todah, right, Sarah the U sauntered back to the flock, you have Sarah the U and Rivka the U. Sarah the U was offered as the korbin Todah. What happens to Rivka the U now? It should be offered with the 40 loaves. Just like if by a korbin chatas, Rivka the U at this point would be left to graze. So if by a korbin Todah, Rivka the U would be offered with the 40 loaves. And yet the Brisa said yesterday that if Sarah the U is offered as the korbin Todah, Rivka the U will be offered but without the loaves. So it's a question on Shmuel's principle. Because Shmuel says in any scenario where by a chatas it's left to graze, by a Todah it would be offered with the loaves. And here we have a scenario where a chatas is left to graze and a Todah is offered without the breads. So ve'ilu gabe chatas, this same scenario where Sarah saunters back to the flock and you have Sarah and you have Rivka and then Sarah is offered as the korbin. So we say that by a Todah, Sarah would be offered as a korbin with the breads, Rivka without the breads. But ve'ilu by gabe chatas, by a chatas in this case where Sarah sauntered back to the flock and then Sarah was offered as the chatas, what happens to Rivka? Ki agavna roeh, Rivka would be let out to graze. And based on Shmuel's principle, that would mean that by Todah, Rivka should be offered with the breads, and yet the Brisa says Rivka is offered without the breads. The Tanan, as we learn in our Mishnah, that we learn in the Mishnah in Tamura, that we learn in the Mishnah by Chatas. We learn in the Mishnah in Masechta Tamura. Right here, we're going to see that by a korbin Chatas, it would be left to graze. Hifrish Chatasai ve'avda, if he sets aside Sarah the U as a korbin Chatas, and then Sarah the U flew the coop. V'ifrish acheres tachtea, so Rivka the U was designated instead. V'nimtzes harishona v'arishtein omdos, and then Sarah the U saunters back to the flock, and now you have Sarah the U and Rivka the U. Miskaper ba'achas meyen, so now one of them will be offered as the korbin chatas. Let's say Sarah the U is now offered as the korbin chatas. The shnia, what happens to Rivka the U? Tamus, Divrei Rebbe. According to Rebbe, Rivka the U would be left to die. But Chacham say, however, Chacham argue, Ein chatas mesa, when we say, like I said earlier, when we talk about chatas mesa, when we talk about if Sarah gets lost, so Rivka is designated as the korbin chatas, and we're saying that there's a chatas mesa there. That's only if Sarah the U flew the coop. So Rivka the U was designated as the korbin chatas and offered as the korbin chatas, and then Sarah the U saunters back to the flock. Rivka the U had already been offered, the owners already got their kapara. In that case, Sarah the U would be left to die. However, hakodim sheniskapu bailim, but if when Sarah the U sauntered back to the flock, Rivka the U was still alive, well then you'll offer one of them and the other one, roeh, is just going to graze. Therefore, we see according to the Chachamim that in this case, when you have both Sarah and Rivka and you're going to choose to offer one, the Chachamim say that by a chatas, the other one would be left to graze, which would mean that by a Todah, the other one, based on Shmuel's principle, should be offered with all of the breads, and yet the Brisa says that the second one by a Todah is offered without all of the bread. Shmuel Karebi Sruli. And for the Gemara, Shmuel doesn't hold like the Chachamim actually. Shmuel holds like Rebbe, that when Sarah saunters back to the flock and Rivka is still alive, and then Sarah is offered as the korbin chatas, Rivka actually would be left to die, which would explain why by a korbin todah, Rivka is offered without the breads. And that, so Shmuel holds like Rebbe, which is why he's saying that, you have this principle that if, whenever by chatas is left to die, so by a todah it's offered without the breads, and there's no question based on when Sarah, the chatas, flies the coop. The Omer Avuda Bishas Afrosha Mesa. That Rebbe says whenever Sarah is gone, has flown the coop at the time that Rivka has been designated to be the replacement, well then the other one is always going to be, Mesa is always going to be let to die, even if Sarah comes back when Rivka is still there. Fine. So therefore it's a situation of chatas hamesa, and that's why by Todah there's no breads. Now, but however, frack the Gemara, 1 second. There were two sides to Shmuel's principle. Shmuel's principle had two sides to it. Yes, there was whenever an animal is left to die by a chatas, by a Todah, it will be offered without the breads. Yes, there was that side of the principle. But there's the other side of the principle. Whenever by a chatas the animal is left to graze, so then by a Todah it will be offered with the breads. Now we're saying that Shmuel holds like Rebbe. Therefore, we had this situation where Sarah flew the coop and then sauntered back to the flock. Rivka was still alive. The Chachamim say that that's a situation of yira, of grazing. However, Shmuel says no, he holds like Rebbe in that case, that's a case of Mesa. So then what would be a case, therefore? So we're saying if Shmuel is throwing in his lot with Rebbe, well then where does Rebbe say yira? Right? Because Shmuel has two sides to his principle. There's a principle of chatos hamesos, that by Todah it would be without the breads. But the other side of the principle is that whenever by a chatas it's left to graze, by a Todah it will be with the breads. What is the case then where Shmuel / Rebbe would say that a chatas is left to graze, and then the parallel case by Todah would be with the breads? Kid Raboshaya. Well, Rebbe says like Raboshaya, the Raboshaya, hifrish shtei chatos la'achrayis miskape bezmen sheyirtze v'ashniya tire. That where Rebbe says to graze is by achrayis. Who can tell me what achrayis is? Achrayis is when you set aside two korbanos, b'etzim. A person needs to bring a korbin chatas, for example, and what he wants to avoid is coming to the Beis Hamikdash to offer his korbin chatas. The chatas is slaughtered and turns out to be pasul somehow. Becomes pasul one way or another. And now he's got to start all over. Buy a new sheep, come back, do pain in the neck. So he says, you know what? I'm going to bring two ewes, and in case there's an issue with the first one, I have a backup. Hopefully everything will go smoothly with the first one. So then what happens to the second one? What happens to the backup? So according to Rebbe, what happens to the backup is that in this case, it would be left to graze. That is the scenario where Rebbe says that by a chatas it's left to graze. A scenario where there's a backup. Person brings two chatases, one just in case there's an issue with the first one. Everything goes smoothly with the first one. The second one is left to graze. Here's the thing. So then what would follow based on Shmuel's principle? What would follow is that in the case of achrayis, by a Todah, right, since by a chatas it's left to graze, by a Todah, what's the halacha? It would be offered with the breads, but that's obviously not the case. Right? If a person says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah, and he shows up with two animals, one as a backup, the first one, everything goes smoothly with the first one, it's offered with all the breads. Obviously, the second one is not going to be offered with all the breads. The first one went perfectly smoothly with all the breads. The second one is not with the breads. Now, based on Shmuel's principle, well, by a chatas, according to Rebbe, the second one would be left, the backup would be left to graze, which would mean that by a Todah, the backup would be offered with the breads. But clearly by a Todah, if the first one went smoothly with all the breads, the second one is just an extra one, it'll be offered without the breads, that's for sure. So we're kind of struggling a bit to get Shmuel's principle to be without difficulties. So now, how do we understand Shmuel's principle? When it comes to Todah Ki Gavna, when there's a backup, the backup, if everything goes smoothly with the first one, the backup, of course, is going to be without the breads. Well, Shmuel holds actually like Rib Shimon, the Amr who says Chomesh, Chatos, Mesos, period. Reb Shimon says there are 5 chatos that are left to die. One of them being chatos sheniskapu bailim ba'acher, that if the owner had already gotten kapara with a different animal, no matter what, the second one is left to die. And even in a scenario of achrayis, even when he shows up with to offer his korban chatas with 2 animals, and the first one goes smoothly, what happens to the second one? Rebbe said it's left to graze. Reb Shimon says no. Since the first one went smoothly, the owner has received his kapara. The second one, the backup, left to die. Chatos amesos. And since it's left to die, so Shmuel holds like Reb Shimon. It's that the backup is left to die, and by a Todah, the backup will be offered without any breads. Okay, that's fine. Okay, fine. So now we're saying that Shmuel is like Reb Shimon, but Reb Shimon doesn't hold of any scenario of roe. Shimon doesn't have a case of let it graze. He says, in all the cases, you just let it die. Reb Shimon doesn't have a scenario where it's left to graze. So what about the second side of Shmuel's principle of whenever it's left to graze, then by an ola would be with the 40 breads? Shmuel nami chada ka'amar. The fact of the matter is, Shmuel actually doesn't have 2 sides to his principle. Shmuel's principle is just one side. Kol shebechatas mesa, that any scenario where by a chatas it's left to die, betoda into nelechem, by a toda it would not require any of the breads. Ma'ika mashmalon. What's the big chiddush over here? Lafuke mid Rabbi Yochanan, to the exclusion of Rabbi Yochanan that we had said earlier. The Amr who says Adam iskape b'shevach hekdish kamashmalon delo. Rabbi Yochanan had said earlier that a person can get kapara with the growth of hektish. That Rabbi Yochanan had said earlier that if somebody says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah, and he sets aside Sarah the pregnant ewe, to be his korbin Todah, and again he says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah, and now Sarah the ewe gives birth to Sarah Jr. the ewe, Rabbi Yochanan says that if Sarah Jr. the ewe is offered first, it would be offered with all of the breads. Shmuel would disagree, because since it's a vlad, since by a chatas this would be vlad chatas, and vlad chatas is lemisa, so by a todah it would be without breads. Sarah the junior ewe would be offered without the breads. So Shmuel's principle is one-sided. It's saying that in any scenario whereby a korban chatas would be left to die, by a korban todah, it would be offered without breads. And on this principle, he disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says that if Sarah the U gives birth, Sarah Junior the U could be offered with the breads. Shmuel would say no, it would be offered, Sarah the U would be offered without the breads. Sheesh. Okay, that wraps up the first section of today's daf, offering the child of a Todah, the Machlokas of Yochanan and Shmuel. That was the part that was going to turn our brains to mush. My brain, thank God, actually at this point is not mush, but that was definitely a mission. That was definitely a mission. The Gemara now kind of lightens up slightly, I think. Reb Abba says, Reb Abba, Zo Todah v'Zo Lachma. If a person says, okay, this is going to be my korbin Todah, these are going to be my breads for the korbin Todah. Avad alechem, what happens if the bread gets lost? Now what do? Maybe lechem acher. Okay, no big deal. Get different bread. Of the Todah, but if the animal gets lost, eno maybe Todah. We don't just say, okay, fine, just get a different animal to bring with the breads. No. Eno maybe Todah acheres, we don't bring a different korbin Todah, rather we just start over. You throw out the breads, you lose the breads. My time, how come? Lechem glal Todah ve'in Todah glal lechem. It's because the breads are coming on account of the Todah. The Todah is not coming on account of the breads, right? So therefore, if a person says, I'm going to bring a korbin Todah, right? This is my Todah, this is my bread. The breads get lost, but we still have the animal. Okay, get different breads. But if the animal gets lost, start over. You're not going to get a different animal for these breads. No. The main thing is the animal. If the animal's lost, start over. Rava says, Rava, amafresh most the todaso, a person sets aside money for his korbin Todah, v'nitosru, and there was extra money. Okay, well the money that he set aside for the Todah, you could spend it on the breads now. The money that was set aside for the animal could be now go towards the breads. Maybe when lechem, you can use that to buy the breads. L'lachmi Todah, but if he had set aside money for the breads of the Todah, v'nitosru, and there was leftover bread money, ein maybe ben Todah, you can't use that money to purchase the animal. My time outcome, ilem mishum de Rav Kahana, if it's because of Rav Kahana, the Amar of Kahana. Minayin l'lachmei Todah, shenikru Todah. How do you know that the breads of a korbin Todah are called a Todah? The breads are also called Todah. Shenem v'ikriv al zevach hatodah chalos. It says zevach hatodah, that we're equating zevach and Todah. I'm sorry, zevach hatodah chalos matzos. Right, we're equating Todah and chalos. So the chalos are referred to as the Todah. But let's also say the opposite, right? Just like Todah and chalos, so chalos and Todah, they're both equated. So answers the Gemara, no, what the pasuk is saying is lechem ikre Todah lo ikre lechem. What it's saying is Todah chalos. What it's saying is that the chalos are the Todah, right? That when you're talking about a korbin Todah, it includes the chalos, and the chalos are part of the korbin Todah. But when you're talking about chalos, it doesn't include the Todah. Todah is an umbrella that includes chalos. Chalos doesn't include Todas, right? We also saw it similarly, right? Also interesting, right? Like a Todah is a type of shlom, shlom is not a type of Todah, right? Anyways, so therefore, if a person sets aside money for the korbin Todah, it could be for the Todah, it could be for the bread. But if he specifically sets aside money for the bread, it would not be for the Todah. Now the Gemara discusses what happens when the korbin keeps on getting lost. We'll see this in the context of a Todah and in the context of a korbin chatas, and then that is the daf. Rava says, Rava, hifrish todaso v'avda, says Rava that if a person set aside Sarah the U to be his korbin Todah, and Sarah the U flew the coop. So he says, okay, Rivka the U, you're going to be my korbin Todah. Rivka the U flew the coop. He says, Rachel the U, you're going to be my korbin Todah. V'nimtzu arishonos, and now Sarah and Rivka are found. V'arish shloshta omdos, and now you have three options for your korbin Todah: Sarah the U, Rivka the U, Rachel the U. It's mamish like yivamis. Niskapi barishona. So if Sarah the U was offered as the korbin Todah, of course with all the 40 loaves, Shnia Eina tuna lechem. So Rivka the U won't need any loaves, right? Because since Sarah the U was offered with the 40 loaves, Rivka the U will be without the 40 loaves. However, Shlish is tuna lechem. But Rachel the U would be with the 40 loaves, since Rachel the U has nothing to do with Sarah the U. Rachel the U was a replacement for Rivka the U. Nothing to do with Sarah the U. So when Sarah the U is offered with the 40 loaves, that has no bearings on Rachel the U. Rachel the U now is going to be offered also with 40 loaves. It was set aside as a Todah. Niskaper b'shlishis, if Rachel the U was offered as the korbin Todah first, so Shnia eina tuna lechem, so Rivka the U would not require any loaves because Rachel the U was a replacement for Rivka the U, and since Rachel the U is offered first, so Rivka the U is kind of the leftover one. It doesn't need any loaves. However, Rishona tuna lechem, Sarah the U will require breads because Sarah the U had no relationship with Rachel the U. Okay, so if Sarah the U is offered first, it requires 40. Sarah requires 40 loaves as well as Rachel the U. And if Rachel the U is offered first, so does, right? So Rachel and Sarah require 40 loaves. In both cases, Rivka does not. Now, be'emtsoyis, if Rivka the U is the one that is offered, well, since Rivka the U is coming to replace Sarah the U, and Rachel came to replace Rivka, so Rivka is kind of connected to both Sarah and Rachel. So shtein ein tunos lechem, neither Sarah nor Rachel will require the 40 loaves, right? Since by offering Rivka, which was the replacement for Sarah, okay, so Sarah is now left over from that and doesn't need 40 loaves. And also, Rachel came to replace it, but now Rivka was offered, so Rachel also would be offered without 40 loaves. Abaye Omer afilu niskaper ba'achas men shtein entunos lechem kulu chalifin dadadeninu. Abaye views this situation differently. Abaye says they all, at the end of the day, are all intertwined. If they're all part of the same mess that he had set aside, he wants to bring a korbin Todah. He set aside one animal, it got lost, the other one got lost, he keeps on setting aside new ones, the other ones are found, they're all part of the same mess, and therefore once one of them is offered, that one will be offered with the 40 loaves, the other two will be offered without the 40 loaves. Omar Reb Zera, and says Reb Zera v'chein, and similarly in chatos, similarly you'll have a similar scenario by korban chatos, ifish chatoso ve'ovda. Sarah the U was set aside as a korban chatos ve'ovda, and it flew Sarah the U flew the coop. Ve'hifish acheres tachtea, so Rivka the U was set aside, was designated as the chatos ve'ovda, and Rivka the U flew the coop. Ve'hifish acheres tachtea, so Rachel the U was set aside as the korban chatos v'nitzu arishonos, and then Sarah and Rivka were found. They sauntered back to the flock. Varei shloshtan omdos, and now you have Sarah, Rivka, and Rachel the Uz. Niskaper barishona, if Sarah the U was offered as the korban chatas shnia tamus, well then Rivka will be right. Chatas, right? It was Rivka was a replacement for Sarah. Sarah was offered. Rivka is chatas niskaper b'alam ba'acher, and it's left to die. However, shlish is tira, but Rachel had nothing to do with Sarah. So Sarah was offered as chatas. Rachel has nothing to do with Sarah. So what do you do with Rachel? You let it graze. You let Rachel graze until it gets a mum. Niskaper b'shlishis, if Rachel was offered as the chatas, shnia tamus, Rivka is left to die, rishona tira, and Sarah is left to graze, because again, Sarah had nothing to do with Rivka. Niskaper b'mtsois, if Rivka is offered as the chatas shtein yamusu, both Sarah and Rachel will be left to die because they are both connected to Rivka. Abaye says, Abaye afilu niskaper be'achas mehen. Abaye says, even if it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter which one of them was offered as the chatas shtein yamusu, the others will both die. Kulu chalifin dadadinenu, because they're all part of the same mess. They were all set aside to be this person's korban chatas. Once he gets his kapara, the other two are would be considered chatosh niskapu ba'aleh ba'acher, and they are left to die. My v'chein. Why do we need, and similarly, right, we said this halacha by Todah, why do we need to say the same thing also by korban chatas? Well, Ma'al Detema may have taught Hasam, who the Ikal Meimar Marbe betodosu. Well, I may have thought davka, right? According to Rava, when it came to korbin Todah, since the korbin Todah, you can just offer another one, right? So kilu, if we said by korbin Todah, if says Rava that if Sarah the U was offered as a korbin Todah, so Sarah the U will be offered with the loaves. Rivka will be offered without the loaves, but Rachel is a new korbin Todah. You designated a new korbin Todah, so it'll be offered with 40 loaves. But you can't say the same thing by korbin chatas. You can't just donate. Say, oh, okay, I'll bring another korbin chatas. You bring a korbin chatas when you have to bring a korbin chatas, and therefore I might think that all of these chatases are being brought for the, but since they're all being brought for the obligation, once one of them is offered, Reb Zera, who was the first opinion by the chatas, would say there that all of them would be left to die in that case, since it's not like you're bringing just like a voluntary chatas. So so therefore Reb Zera is saying no, even there we'll view the third one, right? So if Sarah the U was offered as a chatas, we'll view Rachel the U. We'll just let it graze since it's not connected. It says Reb Zera, we'll consider it like it's not connected to Sarah the U. Friends, we are going to stop here. How long is this already? Yeah, it's already over an hour, and I think at this point my brain is like, starting to get mushy. The next sugya is a Tamura sugya, also not an easy sugya, and it goes until Pei Aleph Amud Bey, Amud at the bottom of Pei Aleph Amud Aleph at the Mishnah Mamish, the last line of the Amud. I think we should probably stop here and pick up from here tomorrow. On the Pei of Masechta Menachos, we learned about offering the child of a Todah. There was a lot more. This is really simplifying it down to its core of what this is. We talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about neders. We talked about nidavas. We talked about when it's coming to swap an initial korbin. We talked about children. We talked about all sorts of stuff. But ultimately, the machlekes here was between Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel when it comes to offering the child of a Todah. Rabbi Yochanan says that if the child is offered first, before the mother is, so then it would be offered with the bread. Right? His chiddush is that you can get kapara with shvach hekdish, right? That this child which grew out of the mother, which was designated, the mother was designated, this child kind of emerged from the mother, you could still fulfill your obligation with that child, and you would offer the child with the all of the breads. Shmuel disagrees because since by a korbin chatos, a vlad chatos is one of the chatos hamesos, his principle is that whenever it comes to chatos hamesos, by a todah it will be offered without bread, and therefore the child of of an animal set aside as a korbin todah will be offered without bread. And finally, we then discuss at the end when the korbin keeps on getting lost. We saw Rava and also Reb Zera that it depends which one is offered. If the first one is offered, then the third one will be considered disconnected. Also, if the third one's offered, the first one's disconnected, etc. Abaye said that they're all basically interdependent because they're all being offered either because you need a todah or because you need a chatas, and therefore once one of them is offered, all of the others are considered extra. Friends, that was the pei of Masechta Menachos. Pesach begins later today. Today should be the day of the Korbin Pesach. There's still time. Friends, have a great day and a great Pesach. Cheers.